So I got woken up at 1:30 or 2, somewhere in that time, and I started hearing the whoops again. But it was close, and it was loud, and it was moving. That is nuts. It was like whoop, 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 whoop. It was going from right to left, from the creek to the road and up the ridge up there. Would you say about 150 yards, Kurt?
Yeah, easily 150 yards.
I would say it was over 15 or 20 seconds. This thing was moving from where the creek was, where we would get water. It was like whoop, 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 and then it started moving right. I thought it was going right through those guys' camp. All of a sudden, I hear this garbling that all I can describe it. They sound like Sierra sounds. That is not whooping. And then it kept going. It kept moving. And then it got back to whoop, whoop, whoop. And then it just went on up the ridge. And I was waking up, Curtis, did you hear that? What the heck was that?
I'd like to welcome Curtis and David to the show. I was introduced to these gentlemen via Jonathan Brown of the famous Brown property in Washington. He spoke highly of them and suggested I should get in contact with them and have them on. And boy, am I glad I did, because Curtis, this is the first time I've talked to David, but you and I talked previously on the phone, and you guys have had some amazing experiences in what seems to be a relatively short amount of time for the Bigfoot world. What got you started personally interested in this topic?
Well, maybe just a quick little background. David and I have been friends for over 50 years. I'm 2 years older than David, but we grew up together. We even went to the same college, and as it turns out, we both went to the same medical school, believe it or not. We're both physicians, so we like to think of ourselves, obviously, as men of science. But after medical school, we sort of drifted apart. He ended up in Central California, and I ended up in Phoenix, Arizona. Obviously, still friends, kind of friends that even though we might not see each other for a year or so, when we do get back together, it's like, no time had we been apart. Now, I really didn't have much of a background or thinking about Bigfoot, so I'll let David start and tell you about his background, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. David, jump on in, man. What got you started in this crazy subject?
Well, yeah, me and Curtis, we were best friends growing up, but as a kid, I was always interested in Native American, history, culture, studied it a lot. I was always the Indian when you played cowboys and Indians. Used to make my own moccasins and hike in the woods and stuff. But I knew that every Native American culture had some type of name for Bigfoot, Sasquatch, hairy men, things like that. I knew they had, spiritual animals, just like, bear, the coyotes, or the eagles and stuff. Getting older, I had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film. I, felt that was real. I've seen people try to debunk that. As I got older and had kids, my own, and nephews, my son Cody and Josh, I took them to Burnside Lake, which is South Lake Tahoe area, and we actually heard some howls there. I took an interest in tracking and, things like that in the woods and stuff. Read a lot of Tom Brown Jr.'s tracking and nature observation books, and that got me interested in the outdoors and things like that.
Big fan of Tom Brown Jr.
Yeah, very good things I learned from that. So try to pass that on sometimes to my kids and, Curtis and things like that when we're out. But I think all that made me, at that point, a probable believer, watch the shows, finding, Bigfoot and now Expedition Bigfoot, things like that. And so that's kind of where I got it.
And then mine wasn't as deeply seated as David's. I had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, but I was more of a skeptic. And then, whatever we might think of finding Bigfoot is something that I watched. And I think the best thing about finding Bigfoot, clearly they never found Bigfoot in all their seasons, but it at least sort of brought it to the consciousness of prime time, exposed it interest to more people. And then that was kind of my background, but on David's 50th birthday, he had a get-together weekend at his house, and one night he said to me, "Hey, find a movie. I'm going to go grab a shower, look on my DVR, and see what you find, and when I get out of the shower, we'll watch a movie." Well, I kind of looked through his DVR, and he had a whole big section on all those things he just talked about. And so I realized, where his interest was, and I had a little interest, but not the same as his by any means. And then 3 years ago, almost exactly to today, my wife and I, with some friends, went to Nepal, and we were hiking over to Everest Base Camp, and our guide just happened to be a Buddhist monk. And about a third of the way to Everest Base Camp, he took us into a temple and showed us a hand and a skull of what he described as being a Yeti skull and hand.
Wow.
And we couldn't touch them. They were behind glass, but I was, looking at it from 6 inches away. And I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I know all about hand anatomy, and that hand looked like a human hand, but it was probably twice as big. And the skull was probably about the size of a human skull if you added a football helmet to it. And the scalp, part of the scalp was still there, and it was covered in really short brown hair. So, I really didn't have much interest in Bigfoot before finding Bigfoot, and then I happened to see the skull and hand of a supposed Yeti. And so David and I had been the kind of friends, like we said, we'd get together periodically on a guy's trip where we might go golfing or go see a sporting event. And after this, he called me up and said, "Hey, let's go on another guy's trip." And so I had said, "Well, why don't we go see if we can find Bigfoot?" And that's kind of where we got started in this.
So how'd you guys pick your first spot to go to?
Yeah, Curtis said, "Hey, see what you think." We felt like, with California, it would be a good place to start, close. So I began doing some research and stuff. I went to the BFRO website, looked up all the counties in California and how many different sightings they had and stuff. And, just with, Bluff Creek and all that with the Patterson-Gimlin, the history up there, Siskiyou County had the most sightings that I could find. So I said, "Hey, let's go up to, Northwestern California." So after that, I started looking on, backpacking and trails, things like that, trying to find, an interesting place to go. I mean, we were just going to go backpacking with guys, quote, bigfooting, but it was more just spend time with Curtis, but I found this interesting trail called the Kelsey Trail. It was on the Smith River, which is about 26 miles east of Crescent City. And I had to go on this, it looked like pretty desolate area. We had to go on a dirt road for like 6 miles. And then the hike in was about 6 miles to where, I felt like we could camp and things like that. So we went into the trailhead there, heading into the Siskiyou Wilderness.
And I think, like David said, we kind of went into this calling it a Bigfoot trip, but we predominantly were expecting just a camping trip or a backpacking trip with friends. And I would say maybe the first 3 days we were there, I think we were there 6 days and 5 nights. First 3 days, maybe we found some X's off in the distance and maybe a tree break here and there, but nothing we could really, honestly say was anything other than just a natural occurrence. And, about the third or fourth day, I think David was looking at his maps again, and he noticed that one of the trails, and we'd been up and down the creek, both north and south, looking all around every single day and evening, hadn't really found much. And he noticed that on the map, there was another trail sort of across this creek. And so he suggested we, take one of the days and go across there. And that's where we started finding some things.
Yeah, there's only one trail, in there and out. And so when we got in there, we found a great campsite right on a peninsula by a creek, and, nice water and things like that and shade. But so we set up our game cams around the entrance, and on that trail. So we knew what was going in and out, and if anyone was around there and things like that. So, and the whole time that we were there, we only saw, we met one guy as he came in, and he went out the next day. So we knew that there was no one else around with us. But so we started going up, crossing the creek over and going up that trail. It was more into the wilderness area, where the direction that it was heading. So we started seeing some suspicious things on, branches like 12 feet high being broken off at 90 degrees. And we had pictures of that, Curtis trying to reach it and things like that. And, other branches around other trees being broken, maybe 7-8 feet tall. One tree we found, it was a big tree, and it's hanging up in the air, and it's had these other 2 vine trees wrapped around it, holding it, but there's no stump, and how the heck did that get there? And we're looking around for the stump. We can't find it. We don't know where it fell from, but it's just hanging pointing up the hill, and there was a game trail right beside it. And so it was just kind of interesting, for that.
Yeah. Interesting to see a tree hanging in the air.
Wrapped, but it's wrapped. It was like wrapped in, these things were weaved around and holding it up. And it's like, that's weird.
And it's probably 4 or 5 feet off the ground, which is, really crazy.
And it was pointing up the hill, you said?
Yeah, the top of the tree was pointing up the hill, and the bottom was, hanging like 4 or 5 feet off the ground with these branches wrapped around holding it up. And I had no idea how it could be twisted like that. Like if you were going to hold it up and pull these branches and wrap the branches around each other to hold up this tree, it's strange. I mean, we have a picture of it. It's kind of very, I don't know how that happens, especially with where the tree comes from, down the hill or up the hill. There was no stump that it came from. And
then we started finding other weird things. We noticed on a couple of different trees that there were, 4 or 5 foot long branches that were sort of stacked up against the tree, leaning on the tree. So something had clearly placed these branches there, and they were essentially pointing in the same direction as the tree stump, or not the tree stump, the tree that was elevated. And these branches, you look at them, they didn't come from the tree. They were completely different types of trees. One of them was even, solid red. It was like from a manzanita bush or something. So whatever had placed them there had brought them there and kind of stood them up against the tree. And I don't know if you've seen Expedition Bigfoot, but this season they were in Northern California. My guess is probably within 50 miles of where we were. And they had a similar finding. Theirs was probably more dramatic, at least on their videos that they've shown on Expedition Bigfoot. They had 15 or 20 foot sticks kind of leaning up against a tree. So it was just that show was sort of confirmation of what we found was just unusual to be off the trail in the wilderness, in a place where no one seemed to be. And obviously we had been there, so other people could have gotten there. But that wasn't even the strangest sort of tree finding that we found. We kind of are now on this side of the trail looking for things. Our interest has peaked. We found an elevated tree. We found other branches all pointing in the same direction. And we eventually found what I describe as an igloo. And I don't know how to describe it any differently. It was a domed dwelling, probably about the size of a 2 or 3 person backpacking tent, about 3 feet in height, maybe 6 feet across or 8 feet across, and maybe 8 feet long. And there was, opening at one end. And so,
but it was weaved.
Yeah. The branches were all weaved together. So this was not, just branches being laid out. They were weaved together to make a sturdy domed structure. And then, so we figured, well, could this be human? I mean, probably most likely it was. But we started looking for other signs of humans being there. First thing I noticed, I don't even know if I said it to David at the time, but inside the structure, most people, when they put down a tent, will kind of move all the sticks out and rocks and put their tent down. Nothing had been cleaned out, but it was all compressed down. So whatever slept there slept right on whatever was inside the dome. Huh. And then the next thing, we look for a fire pit. You're out in the middle of nowhere, and even in the summer, it was probably in the mid 40s at night. And most people are going to have a fire, if not for warmth, just for something to look at in the middle of the night. There was no fire pit. And then we started looking for, maybe there's trash or something, because, humans, even if you're trying to be clean, you're going to leave some scraps of paper or wrappers or something. And there was nothing.
Just a
bunch of crap. Yeah, literally. So then we started looking around, and like David said, we found 5 or 6 piles of scat that were just huge. And it looked like human scat, but bigger than anything I've ever done in my life. And we started thinking, what could do this? Like I said, we kind of, beforehand on our drive up, we wanted to look at everything from a scientific side or viewpoint, and if we could rule it out as being, some other cause, we would. But it didn't look like bear scat. It didn't look like deer or elk scat. There's nothing else that big that we know of in the area. It looked like human scat, but probably 3 times the amount. And then the other crazy thing is, in our camp, we went maybe 150 feet away to do our business, and we buried it so we wouldn't step on it the next day or smell it or anything like that. These were all sitting on top of the ground. There was no toilet paper. There was no evidence of any like moss or leaves that anything had used to clean themselves. Whatever had done it had just squatted 5 or 6 times around its dwelling and did its business. So really strange. No sign of other humans had been there, but we find this dwelling, if you would, and scat all around.
Were there any signs of like tools being used to like cut the limbs or anything?
No.
They all look broken. We did look at that. I didn't mention it. None of them had been cut with an axe or a saw. They had all been snapped or fallen. Maybe they were deadfall that had been dragged into the area. I don't know, but they had all been broken some way and had no cut ends on them.
I mean, that's just so weird. If it was a human, that's a pretty long-term structure for a primitive shelter for someone to make. You would think there would definitely be signs of a fire and, the limbs being cut to create the shelter. That just seems so weird that anybody would go back there and do it by hand and not build a fire and not clear it out and then to just defecate all around it. I mean, that doesn't sound human at all to me.
No, I mean, that's exactly what we thought. So, we thought with those findings, we'd kind of hit the jackpot, and that would be as good as anything we found the rest of the week. But I was wrong. Luckily, I was wrong.
Yeah. So the next thing that I think we found, we'd gone back, up to that trail, up to about 2 miles and stuff. But in the same area, we had found a lot of the trees and stuff like that. I'm always looking for traps, and trying to find, places I can see traps and things like that. And I hadn't noticed it on a day or two before, but about 30 yards off the trail, we're walking and I see this kind of wet area. And I say, "Hey, Kurt, there's a trap. Let's just go over there and look and see what we can see." And, we think you expect to see like deer tracks or, whatever, even if there's bear in the area, things like that, you could do that. But so we go walking off there, and it's 30 yards off the trail behind brush and stuff. I could just see through the brush and see, wetness over there. I just wanted to go look at it. So we go walking over there, and there's this probably a marsh, the marsh is about don't know, Curtis, what do you say, 15 to 20 feet across, and, maybe a double length, wide, but there's nothing, there's water in it, mud, things like that, but it was nothing I would want to walk through. And
it was probably about, the size of a home swimming pool in area, at least. It wasn't huge. It wasn't a big lake. It was just a little marshy area, and probably at its depth, it was 4 inches deep, maybe 6 inches at most.
But you didn't have to walk through it to go past it. We walked around it. Just you go 10 feet this direction, and you walk around it on dry land, and you go around the other side. So it's like if you're a human, why would you walk through there and get your boots all dirty? But so we go there, and all of a sudden I go, "Hey, Kurt, look at that!" And there was three footprints walking right through the middle of the marsh, and I go, "Wow, this is crazy." So we go over there, and we got the pictures of comparing our foot size to the thing. And Curtis and me both wear 13s, and a picture of, it's about twice as wide as his foot and about 3 or 4 inches longer than his shoe. So it figures probably measuring about, I think, 13 shoes, about 13 inches, 13, 14, so probably measuring about 15 inches long and about twice as wide as his shoe. And there was like three steps. You could see it in the water. You could just see the imprint in the water. And the second one was about a foot or two past it, like a left foot first and then a right foot. But then the third step was like over 4 feet. The next step was 4 feet further out. And then there was about another 4 feet to get out of the swamp from that side. And there was no step on there. So we figured that the guy, whatever made it, made the first step, second step, the third step, and fourth step out, onto the dry area. And so it was about, 4 to 5 feet, step length, on there, with it. And again, so we're saying, hey, this is bipedal. This is not like, for a bear to step on itself and make look like a footprint, things like that, you'd have to do it 3 times in a row and do that. And we say, well, what is this? How do you make that? And see, well, people could run and jump and make that type of step length or stride length. You can do that, but if you're running and you jump and step in mud, you're going to slide.
Yeah. That's
there was no sliding. There was nothing of that, around these things. It was just a walking step into the wet, with a stride. So something bipedal walked across that with a 16-inch foot, with a probably 6 inches wide, and a step length of about, 48 to 50 inches long. And so the crazy thing about that was that, so we were like, wow, this is amazing. So we were getting kind of excited about that. And we go back, and we came back the next day to look at it and inspect it some more. And the interesting thing was that the third step had disappeared. It had been reabsorbed, by the marsh. And we took a picture of that. So that was kind of like, okay, if this is going to disappear in 24 hours, then that has to be recent. That has to be, within 24 hours that was made, for us.
I saw a photo, I believe, of that trackway that you're talking about, and it's definitely bipedal. Yes. Anything with 4 legs leaves a very definite trail, especially through a spot like that. And the telltale signs of a 4-legged animal going through there were just not there at all.
And it looked like right, left. Exactly what you're saying, bipedal. It did look bipedal. So, we see that, go back to camp, decide that's where we're going to kind of concentrate our efforts. We had a couple days left. Next day, we decided to go out there kind of close to the marshy area and just kind of sit and listen to, what was happening around us. David had these sound amplification headphones, And he was probably 75 yards away from me up against a log, just sitting there. And I was sort of off the trail, sort of sitting under a bush. And I could see him, he could see me. We could probably see, 240 degrees, each of us around. And we sat there for about an hour. And with these headphones, I could whisper and he could hear me and vice versa. So we could converse without making too much noise. And we could hear things off in the distance kind of moving around, but we had no idea. We couldn't tell if it was bipedal by what we could hear. But things were definitely moving around us. And finally, after about an hour, I noticed that there, close to him, there was this, what looked like a broken tree just across from the marsh. And I had never noticed it before, but just sitting there for an hour, I finally was staring at this thing. And it was under the canopy of a redwood tree. And, the canopy of a redwood tree is probably, 50 feet at least across, and not much grows underneath the canopy of a redwood tree because of the, there's no light, number one. Number two, all the pine needles kind of, you ever tried to grow grass underneath a pine tree, it just doesn't happen,
Right.
So it caught my attention being in a weird spot. Maybe it was a tree that had just been broken off by something, but when we decided we were done listening, I kind of walked up to this thing, and David's looking at me like, "What are you doing?" And I just started looking at it, and it didn't widen out at the base like a tree kind of would, and I started moving it, and there was a little micro motion, and pretty soon I had the thing loose, and I pulled it out, and it was not a stump. It was clearly broken on both ends, and it had been jammed in the ground about 6 inches, and it was sticking up about 3 foot out of the ground. So, something had taken this 3.5 foot long stick and jammed it in the ground, and it was literally right across from the marsh. And, part of what caught my attention, not only why would something grow under the canopy of a redwood tree? But I had seen on YouTube other people describing sticks being stuck in the ground, or trees even being upturned and upside down and jammed into the ground. And, obviously maybe something could have done it when it was muddy. But I took that thing out, and David has a video of me trying to jam that thing in the ground with the sharp end, and I didn't make a dent. So if it didn't happen when it was muddy, it took a lot of force to jam that thing 6 inches into the ground. So it was literally right across from the marsh where whatever had done those 3 steps in the marsh and crossed came out onto the trail. It was as if, I know we're kind of making an assumption here, but it was as if it was a marker as to where to cross the main trail.
Could you tell what kind of tree it was?
So yeah, we could not tell, but we did look around. It clearly was not a redwood. It was not a branch that had fallen out of the redwood tree, yet it was under the canopy of a redwood tree. So then we're looking around to see if any of the trees around it had a branch that size that had broken, or if there was a stump around or anything like that. Just like David said, we looked for that stump of that elevated tree. We could not find a source of that tree. So this, I guess you'd call it a log more than anything. It was probably 4 inches in diameter and about 3.5 feet, long. My guess is it probably weighed about 30 pounds, not heavy by any means, but we could not find a place where it had come from. So whatever had put it in the ground, from what we could see, had brought it from somewhere deeper in the forest.
I mean, that, as far as I'm aware of, that takes hands. So you're pretty limited down to either humans or Bigfoot at that point. And I don't see a human just carrying around a log like that.
Yeah, it was crazy.
So that's crazier.
Yeah, our last story of California, it was the last morning, as David said, we had set up our base camp about 5 or 6 miles in from the trailhead, and we took all our day trips out of there, come back at night. Well, our last morning, we were planning on leaving. We both woke up about 6 a.m., got out of our tents. About 5 minutes later, I decided to put on some water to get our coffee going. And we had sort of set up our backpacking stove underneath the canopy of another redwood that was in our base camp. It was probably, 30 feet or so from our tent. And so I started pouring water into a pot, and all of a sudden a pine cone lands right near my left foot. Okay, no big deal. I'm under the canopy of a redwood tree. A redwood tree has pine cones. There are hundreds of pine cones on the ground all around us. Well, about 3 seconds later, before I even light the fire, another one lands by my right foot. Well, again, didn't think much of it. And David's standing under the canopy maybe 8 feet from me, and he's seeing all this happen. But, still could be natural. 2 pine cones fall. But we looked up, and, there's not a breath of wind in the air whatsoever. So I go sit down in my little backpacking camp chair about 8 feet away, and same thing happens. Now I'm sitting down, and it's like a perfect miss. 1 pine cone lands by my right foot, and 1 pine cone lands by my left foot. And, I'm looking up into the tree, and David decides to back up into the opening, and he can kind of tell you what he was looking for.
Well, when the first ones in there didn't even think anything of it. When the last 2 almost hit him when he's sitting in the chair, I'm like, what the heck is going on? And I start looking up at the tree, and I couldn't see much, so I backed off about 10, 20 feet to get out from underneath the canopy, and I'm sitting here looking up in the tree and trying to see it. I'm under open sky and trying to look up as far as I could to see it. I don't see any squirrel. I seen a squirrel like 50 feet away in the opposite direction in a tree, but not up in that tree. And all of a sudden, a pine cone lands by my foot, and then another pine cone lands by my foot,
and he's out in the open.
And I'm in the open. There's nothing above me. And I'm what the heck? And as soon as that happened, I think both of us, it was just, I can still see us, both of us realizing that this is not natural. And we both stood up and turned to our, my left, his right, looking up the ridge above our camp at the same time. Like, we just both turned up, and immediately it stopped. And I started looking at these things and realized that 2 or 3 of these pine cones are actually green. And, we took a picture of one to show that it was green. And I was like, how the heck are green pine cones falling out of a tree unless you got some sniper squirrel, that's throwing pine cones at us, from there. But, that was about, 7 or 8 pine cones. It seemed the only thing we could say was thrown at us, at 6 a.m. And you're like 6 miles into somewhere. Someone would have, if someone's, punking us or something, we had trail cams up on the trail. We didn't see anybody coming in. They would have to hike in at 6 a.m, probably leave at 2 a.m. just to go do that, hike in, throw pine cones and leave, because we packed up after, that and started heading out in the morning, and we didn't run into anyone for about 3 or 4 miles until we were almost out,
and those people that we ran into, had not been camping. They both had a water bottle and a granola bar. They had just come into the trailhead about 8 a.m. They said they were just scouting for a camping site for the next weekend. So they didn't, they had not camped there overnight. There's no way that these guys, like we said, unless they had been there at 2 a.m. at the trailhead, walked in and then walked back out and then walked back towards the wilderness again to see us, could they have punked us? And they just didn't have the equipment. It was a married couple. I just can't see a married couple getting there at 2 a.m. and just happening to find somebody camping and decide to throw pine cones at them when they get up at 6 a.m.
Yeah, nobody's doing that. I mean, in an area like that, most of the people there, the vast majority of people there, are going to kind of be under the same mindset, and they're not going to be messing with people. They're not, they're trying to avoid people. That's why they go there. The idea to like start throwing pine cones at somebody from the bushes, I don't think anybody would do that.
We hadn't heard of that before, and what was interesting was afterward, we started seeing some comments, or maybe you just don't even think about it. It's like when you buy a car, you start seeing that car all over the place. But we started hearing people mention that they had pine cones, thrown at them, and you go, that's what happened to us. Anyway, it was strange.
So that was our California experience over about 5 days. And here we are, we're rookies. We're going into this not believing we'll find anything. And we had talked going up. I was more of a skeptic than David. Obviously, he had a more deep-seated foundation on Bigfoot than I did. My Bigfoot was learned through finding Bigfoot, and I was quite skeptical. But after all that happened in our California trip, I was now at least open to believing that it was possible, if not probable, that there was a Bigfoot out there.
I mean, those are some amazing experiences, especially for a first time out. I mean, those would have been amazing experiences for your 100th time in the field, for a veteran Bigfooter.
Well, like we said, we were not expecting anything. We kind of went into this thing, we're going to go find Bigfoot, but we pretty much decided we were just going to be two guys out camping and backpacking and having a good time. And if we found something, it was, icing on the cake.
Did you guys get anything on your trail cams while you were there?
The only thing we got was us and the guy that we ran into him one day that we were hiking. He was coming in overnight, and then he walked out the same night. We saw him going in, we saw him going out. We talked to him both times. So we knew when he was there, and we knew when he left. And that was the only thing we got on the trail cams.
Any signs of wildlife or anything?
No. Nothing on the trail. No animals on the trail cam. So, that was kind of disappointing. But then, we've obviously seen things where people have said, possibly, obviously nobody knows, maybe Bigfoot can see if they are out there, maybe they can see the infrared on the game cam and they avoid them. But no wildlife whatsoever that we saw the whole time we were out there. And we never, in fairness to our critics, we never saw Bigfoot. We never got a picture of a Bigfoot, but we had some crazy experiences that, as guys who tried to explain things, we're both scientists, we're both physicians, we can't explain them other than potentially if it was a Bigfoot. And, we get a lot of joshing from our friends and family that, we've come to this conclusion, even though we've never, seen a Bigfoot or got a picture of a Bigfoot.
Yeah, but whenever it comes to this stuff, I call it the 50-50 rule, which is pretty much as good as you're going to get without having an actual physical sighting of a Bigfoot. And that's whenever you get to the point where you're like, with the log, for instance, where it's, okay, well, this was either a person or it was a Bigfoot. And then you just kind of have to go over the idea of like, okay, well, how probable is it that it was a human? And in everything you're describing, there doesn't seem to be any signs of it being human as the cause.
Right. And that was basically our thinking as well. All the things that we found kind of off that trail across the creek, how do you explain an igloo made out of sticks that are weaved with no other sign of humans around? How do you explain that, 3 steps across a 20-foot marsh with 16-inch feet? How do you explain that log jammed into the ground exactly where that thing would have crossed the trail had it, crossed that marsh? There aren't many explanations of that being human behavior, all those things.
Who's throwing pine cones at us?
Yeah. Pine cones falling out of a tree is a pretty random occurrence. And just the sheer number in that amount of time and the fact that they all landed by you guys and nowhere else, something was throwing pine cones at you.
And with no wind.
Yeah.
I mean, if you could expect it if there was a 30-mile-an-hour wind and I was sitting under a redwood, that, 5 or 6 pine cones might fall in a 2-minute period. But then even with that, if there was wind and there wasn't, I'd explain 2 or 3 landing all around David out in the open. That would have taken a 100-mile-an-hour wind to do that, and there was no wind. And, the other thing, as I think back on that experience, they were like perfect misses, if you would. We were never hit, but we were also, whatever was throwing them sort of let us know that if it wanted to, it could have hit us with those pine cones. I mean, they were all within a foot of us.
Yeah, it wasn't over like minutes. This was within 30 to 60 seconds that all this happened.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's even crazier. To get completely unscientific about it, did you guys ever have a sense of like being watched?
The only time I'd say is something is that when we both turned to look up, at that point when they started landing by me, I think we both felt something was there throwing things at us, whatever it was. We both turned at the same time. We both had the same, I felt the sensation. We both looked in the same direction, at the same time. We both, it was at that point I said, something is doing this, and that was the only time that I would have felt there was,
And I would say my turning and looking up there, you hear a lot of people say that they kind of felt like they're being watched the whole way in on a trail or something like that. I didn't have that feeling. It was sort of a quick process of elimination. There was a creek behind us. Couldn't have come from across the creek because that was probably across the creek was maybe 150 feet. So those would be some tremendous throws. So we were sort of surrounded on 2 sides by a creek behind us. The trail kind of flattened out off to our left, and we could see down there. There was nothing there. It was just more of a process of elimination. I knew it wasn't behind me on the creek, and I knew it wasn't down by the trail. So to me, it was just more process of elimination. I just sort of reasoned that it had to be up there. I personally never had a sense that something was watching me. I just, had a realization that these pine cones were coming up from the ridge behind our tent.
Did you save one of the pine cones?
We didn't save it. I took a close-up of one of the green ones because I was like, no one's going to believe that there's green pine cones. And I said, yep, I'm taking the picture of this one.
And clearly, we admit we're kind of rookies at all this. This is our first trip. We had a lot of mistakes. We didn't have a tape measure to measure the, footprints. We didn't bring back one of the pine cones. We didn't have any audio recorders out. We just had game cameras, and we had some night vision infrared FLIR cameras that we never found anything on. But we were just kind of newbies out there, again, not expecting to find anything. So yeah, we probably should have brought one of those home and maybe seen if there was DNA on it or whatever. But we were, in a real sense, just rookies at doing this.
I just asked because I've seen a few people with a rock sitting up on their mantles before that they brought home from these outings.
Yeah, we should have brought a trophy, but we didn't.
Yeah, I had a really good friend that was on an outing in Alabama, I believe, and they weren't even doing anything at the time. They were sitting around the campfire, and they thought that a rock had been thrown at them, and it kind of got their attention, so they were paying attention, and she said the next thing you know, this rock comes whizzing by her head and hits the tree right behind her chair. And, it hit pretty hard, and it just landed right there on the ground next to her, and she took it home with her. So I understand completely. I've also experienced the whole rock throwing thing myself, and the whole perfect miss concept is exactly what it seems like they do. I can't believe that they can't hit you. I just choose that they choose not to hit you. But yeah, it's weird how they do that. Do you guys have any theories on the purpose of that? Do you think they're just trying to get your attention or mess with you or see how you'll react? What do you think they're doing that for, if they are responsible for it?
I think it'd be, an attention thing. Hey, this is our area. We've been walking around the area where they've been walking on their game trails and things like that. So I don't know.
I kind of have the same thought as David. None of that happened until we crossed the creek. Once we did that, sort of the next day or the second time we went across the creek into their territory, found all these things. Obviously this is just me assuming, but I think they were letting us know that they were around and this was their territory. Now, obviously I have no knowledge of what they might be thinking, but I think they were just letting us know. And as it turns out, it just happened to be the morning we were planning on leaving anyway. So
yeah, we were going to leave anyway, guys. So
no, really we had planned. I had to be back to work on Monday. This was Friday. We had a 2-day drive out, and then I had a plane to leave. So we had kind of planned on leaving on the Friday, no matter what. It just, maybe if we had planned on staying on Saturday or till Saturday, who knows? Maybe we would have left on Friday anyway. But because of the pine cones, I don't know.
Yeah, that next night could have gotten real interesting.
Yeah, we didn't leave because of the pine cones, for sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the piles of scat that you found. Where were these in relation to the shelter?
All around. I mean, like within 40 or 50 feet, and they were not in the same area. I mean, it was literally sort of circumferential around the dwelling. So it was kind of as if whatever decided it had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night or whatever, just decided, well, I went, to the right yesterday. Now I'm going to the left today. There was, like I said, 6 or 8 piles, and they were just literally scattered all around. Like I said, in our camp, we all went in one place. So we knew to avoid it, knew we didn't want to step in it, knew we didn't want to smell it. These were all around the camp.
David, I'm going to put you on the spot since you brought up Tom Brown Jr. earlier. Any idea on how old the scat was?
I would, in looking at it, it wasn't like wet per se. I would probably think a week or 2 weeks, something like that. It wasn't like, not like dry, falling apart dry, but, definitely in the, medium time, I'd say medium time frame.
Just in terms of speculation, my mind is kind of going to an area of it was possibly used as like sort of a boundary marker around the shelter, kind of a, stay away, I'm here type thing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Could be. They were all probably in a 50 to 75 foot radius around the dwelling. So could be. And like you said, they're not in one spot, so they did go all around. So maybe it wasn't random. Maybe it was sort of a, hey, this is my territory, don't come in.
Yeah, that's so weird. I have never heard anybody find something like that before.
Yeah, we hadn't either in our research, and a crazy finding. We certainly were not expecting to find it, and we do have some pictures, at least, of the igloo structure. I can't remember. Maybe David took some pictures of the scat. I don't really remember about that though.
So you guys weren't finished though, and I mean, as crazy as all that stuff is, and as remarkable as it is, the next trip was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, it was.
Did you guys just have Bigfoot fever at that point and had to get back out there? How long was it before you were in Washington?
It was about 2 years later. We definitely were like, hey, we got to do this again. We were excited about what we had. So that was in 2022, and we did the California trip, and then this year was when we decided to go again. So probably January of this last year, we started planning it and decide, hey, when we want to go. You know, we had talked before about when to do it, and we pretty much the same week. We always try to do it before hunting season starts. You know, I just don't want to be out there, you know, during hunting season, deer season, and things like that. So we try to decide, okay, where do we want to go? Do we want to go to the same place? Do we want to do something different? We thought about going to Canada, and I was like, I wouldn't mind going to Canada, you know, but there's difficult getting guns and stuff up there, and you know, I feel like I need to have my self-protection and stuff with there. So we said, okay, let's not do Canada. We looked at Alaska. That's a long ways to go. So we thought, hey, how about Oregon or Washington? You know, so that's kind of, we decided to go from there.
And like David said, we started our research. David had done most of the research for the California trip and finding a spot. I semi-retired in January, so I work about half time, and I have more time now. I started, scrubbing YouTube and trying to find people who had been in Washington. And, obviously I realized pretty quickly that Washington had more sightings than any other of the lower 48 states. I think at the time I started looking, the BFRO said there were 676 Class A and Class B sightings, and those are just the ones that were reported to the BFRO. There's obviously many that go unreported. So we figured Washington would be, relatively easily accessible. Then we started looking at the population. We wanted to try to get, as far away from population center as we could, and 80% of the population of Washington is on the western half of Washington, and only 20% on the eastern half. So we kind of concentrated on the eastern half of Washington. And then I started finding videos on YouTube. One of them was from Grassman 58. That's his title. I think his name's Will Fulmer. I don't know if you know him, but he has a number of videos. He describes a corridor sort of starting in northeastern Washington where we were. And I think he describes 4 zones going south through Washington. He describes them as A, B, C, and D. So I think we ended up in his A zone. And he has a number of videos, and a lot of them are concentrated around Sullivan Lake, which is the northeastern corner of Washington. And he has some specifically along the Sullivan Creek, which feeds into Sullivan Lake. And there's a campground that has 18 spots, and they're sort of spread out over about 12 miles or so along Sullivan Creek Road. And he has videos specifically of having quite a bit of activity near the end of those campgrounds, specifically in campsite 17. I think he has a whole video located in that area. And he seems pretty reasonable. A lot of people on YouTube are, what should I say, enthusiasts who every little sound is Bigfoot and every little, crack in the woods is Bigfoot. But he seemed very reasonable on his videos, and he even has a video of, he left out his infrared camera one night pointing across the small lake. I don't think it was near Sullivan Lake, but a small little lake. He just left it out at night, and at 2 a.m, he saw 2 upright individuals come out of the forest and start rummaging on the shoreline. They stayed out about an hour or so, and then went back into the forest. And he realized that the next day when he watched it, he went over there, and there was no trail over there. And whatever had been there had been digging up clams in the middle of the night at 2 a.m, freshwater clams.
Oh, wow.
So, so that was kind of our reason to pick northeastern Washington. I then went and called the ranger because I wanted to do my due diligence, and I asked him where we could camp that was sort of as far away from the other campsites as possible, but still we had access to water. And the ranger suggested Gypsy Meadows, which is probably a mile or a mile and a half past campsite 17 further into the wilderness, but yet it had a bathroom maybe an eighth of a mile away if we needed it, and it had fresh water with Sullivan Creek. So we sort of chose Gypsy Meadows as the place that we were going based on that Will Fulmer's videos.
Yeah, so that's when we decided to go, and we didn't know what it was like. We talked about all these camps, and we realized that this was it's a long, like 7 to 8 miles up this dirt road, and the camps are all spread out. So when we got up to Gypsy Meadows, it was we got there mid afternoon, and we went to the end of the campsite that we were farthest into the meadows. And found a nice campsite over there and set up camp. There we saw one guy in a trailer that was camped right in the campground right before Gypsy Meadows on the same side. It was about an eighth of a mile from us, but the meadow was about 150 yards long and about 50 yards wide in that area. And it was right close to the creek. You could drive up right close to the creek and get water if you needed.
So we start setting up camp, and after getting my tent up in 10 or 15 minutes, I start blowing up my air mattress with a little electric backpacking pump I have, and it makes a whine. The engine and the fan make a whine. And as soon as I turned this on, we noticed that a owl in the middle of the afternoon started hooting at us from across the creek, maybe a quarter mile away, and seemed a little strange that an owl would hoot during the day, but we did some research, and that was sort of the lower end of the range of the barred owl, and sometimes it's known to hoot during the day. So we didn't really think much of it, but as soon as I turned off the motor, the hooting stopped. And we kind of mentioned the hooting, not that it couldn't be an owl, but hooting sort of came before everything strange that happened after that.
Yeah, so we didn't think much of that when we first happened. Hey, that sounded like an owl, It's just what started happening, later really got kind of nuts. But so we got there, we set up camp. We still had an hour or two, so we went hiking. At the end of the meadow, there's a trail that goes out, and then we crossed the creek and started following some game trails and the things that we had found. And I found like this time we're bringing found a 14-inch footprint, and I go, Kurt, look at this. And it's just out in the forest bed. It's not like a trail or anything. We found this indentation of about an inch or two depth, and when we step there, we're not making any dent in the ground with it. So that's interesting. It's a little bigger than what our shoe was, but it was a lot deeper than what we were doing. And so the next day we decided to go back, and I tried to cast that. It wasn't a great print, but we'd never cast anything. I said, hey, it'll be good experience, good practice. Let's see what we can do. And
Sure.
Curtis had brought in some apples and peanut butter. We decided to put a game camera on that area and put out these gifting things, and see if we could draw something in, with that. At that night, we go, okay, what do we want to do? This again was, fire season, so we couldn't have a fire. So we said, hey, let's go driving. So we would go at night. Most of the nights we were there, we'd go driving on the road. I have a camera on my truck, pick up things that if someone was run across, because you never know,
right?
And stuff. So we go driving around, and we drove up into a trailhead, area, one afternoon, and, we hiked, and you could see how desolate it was out there. The only thing we saw one place was the fire lookout building way up on another ridge. But you could see into Canada, Idaho, about 5 miles away. It's just wilderness stuff. Wow. So it's just pretty far out there.
Any signs of people other than the guy in the trailer?
Yeah, there were a few who had been up at on the trail. We saw one guy hiking back. His car was parked up there at the trailhead, and we actually saw 2 rangers up there on horses, and they were out on the trail where it went off in the wilderness. They were just coming back as we went in. So, yeah, we saw 3 other people. Now the rangers, we got back to the trailhead after we hiked, and they had loaded up their horses into their trailer, and they drove back as best we could tell clear to the ranger station, which was at Sullivan Lake, like 15, 16 miles away. Now where these other people went when they came out of the trailhead, I have no idea, but their car was gone as well. So there were other people out there. But then that evening, we were not allowed to have fires, which is kind of disappointing, because that's what you do at night around a campfire, is you sit there and it gives you warmth. It's kind of like watching the TV at home. And right before bed, that same owl across the creek started hooting a little bit, and it was kind of right as we were turning off the lights. And again, we didn't think much of it. But that night, for whatever reason, the previous night I'd fallen right asleep, but that night I just could not get to sleep. I don't know if it was because I was on a mattress or what. And we probably went to bed about 9:30, and about 10 to 12, I looked at my watch. I still wasn't asleep. And about 15 minutes later, that owl started hooting again. And this time it didn't stop. It would hoot like 4 hoots, and then another set of 4 hoots, wait 10 or 15 seconds, do it again. And this went on for probably a minute and a half, and there were no responses to his call or her call. And then the hoots started getting quicker. They sounded louder. I don't know if it had come closer. And then the hoots degenerated into what I clearly believe I heard were whoops, not hoots. They were whoops. And after a couple of whoops, all of a sudden to our north, and this was off to the west that we had heard this one owl, off to the north there was a response of hoots, and it was clearly a deeper voice. And then behind our camp up a ridge, there was another response, and they were hoots. But once that, whatever that being was, owl or other, once it heard a response, it stopped hooting after about 2 minutes. Well, now I'm kind of wondering what this was. And again, rookie mistake, we didn't have our recorders out. But I try to go back to sleep, and next thing I know, it starts up again. I look at my watch. It's now about an hour later, and I hadn't fallen asleep. Same exact pattern, that started hooting. The hoots turned to whoops. Once they got whoops, the responses came back. And next thing I know, it seems like it was only 5 minutes later, I'm being awakened by David, but I apparently had finally fallen asleep. And about 2:15, 2:30, he wakes me up, and he had heard something even more astonishing.
So that afternoon, some other campers came in. There was a couple guys showed up. We were about 17, 18-year-old, and then the other one was in his late 20s or so, I would guess, about that. But they were at the other end of the meadow, which is about 150 yards away from us and stuff. But so I got woken up at 1:30 or 2, somewhere in that time, and I started hearing this whoop, the whoops again. And it was close, and it was loud. And, I get up and started listening to this thing, and it was moving. And I was like, that is nuts. It was like, whoop, 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 whoop. But it was going from right to left if I was looking towards those guys' camp. It was going from right to left, and from the creek to the road and up the ridge up there, would you say about 150 yards, Kurt?
Yeah, it was easily 150 yards.
Yeah, but this thing was moving, and I would say it's over 15 or 20 seconds. This thing was moving from where the creek was, where we would get water. It was like whoop, 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 and then it started moving right. I thought it was going right through those guys' camp. I thought it was like right on top of them, where you, for perspective of where you're trying to see the sound. But right in the middle of all, there was a whoop, whoop, whoop. All of a sudden, I hear this garbling that all I can describe it. Rah, 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 they sound like Sierra sounds. I heard Sierra sounds. And it goes, that is not whooping. And then it kept going, it kept moving. And then it got back to whoop, whoop, whoop. And then it just went on up the ridge with it. And I was waking up, Curtis, did you hear that? What the heck was that? And he comes climbing out. We look down the meadow, and these two guys are climbing out of their tent with their flashlights, looking around and seeing what the heck's going on. And so it was about 2 o'clock, 2:30, at that time. And we didn't hear anything else after that, but I was kind of like, that is crazy. And again, we hadn't, we're doing rookies again. We hadn't turned on our recorders that night, being it was the first or second night that we were there. And so we were like, that is nuts. So we finally went back to bed. And then, the next morning, we went.
So it wasn't a restful night's sleep, obviously, but so I got back in bed about 2:30, like David said, and we'd all been out, all four of us, looking around this meadow with our flashlights, trying to figure out what had made the sound. And I hadn't heard the Sierra sounds like David had. I had only heard the hoots and whoops, at midnight and 1 o'clock. I must have fallen asleep in between, but eventually get back to bed, kind of in and out of sleep. Finally, I see light coming in around 6 a.m., and I decide I'm not sleeping anymore. I'm just going to get up and walk to that quarter or eighth of a mile or so to the bathroom. And when I got down there, the older of the two guys who had been in that tent at the other end of the meadow was coming out of the bathroom. And I kind of wanted to ask him what his experience was without, giving him a leading question. And I said, boy, that was kind of a crazy night, wasn't it? And he said, yeah, what was that? And I shrugged my shoulders and said, I don't know, just, trying to get him to tell me what had happened. And he said, man, I think there was more than one of them, whatever it was. And they were right on top of me. One may have even been up in the tree above my tent.
Wow.
And he said they started, running past my tent eventually, and then up across the little road going into the meadow, up the ridge behind your camp, and they were gone. And he said, and while they were running, they were barking. And I said, you mean like a dog? And he said, well, not really, but that's the only way I can describe it. And so I said to him, well, can you imitate what you heard? And he kind of did his best, and he repeated exactly what David just did. It sounded exactly like the Sierra sound. So David was still asleep, but we had confirmation that what David had heard was exactly what this guy had heard. And he said, well, what was that? And I said, I don't know, but have you ever heard of the Sierra sounds? And he said, no, I haven't. And I said, well, what do you think of Bigfoot? And he kind of had a nervous chuckle and shrugged his shoulders and kind of turned around and walked back towards his camp. Incidentally, I don't know if they had planned it. I didn't talk to him again, but shortly after breakfast, they were out of there. I don't know if it's because of what they heard or that was their plan to only be there one night, but they were pretty much gone right after breakfast. But so here it's 6:15. I talked to this guy for about 5 or 10 minutes. David's asleep. After I get done going to the bathroom, they both described that it went up this ridge and across the main road. So I walked out to the main road and walked up the road, maybe 150 yards, and that was probably about the level of our camp, into the meadow. So it was essentially parallel to our camp. And I noticed across the road a tree break that was about 9 or 10 feet up. And it was clearly a tree break sort of pointing further into the wilderness. And it was right up against, the road was sort of right up against an incline that I would estimate was at about 50 degrees. And something had sort of churned up the dirt up that, the grass and stuff up that incline. And this is not something that I would be trying to climb. But whatever had come across the road literally went up the incline right next to this tree break. So I start thinking, well, there's got to be a game trail that they came, from behind our camp up to the road. So I cross the road and start looking, and sure enough, I find a game trail coming out. So I kind of mark it with a stick, make sure we can find it later if we head up there. And even though it was maybe 100 to 150 yards behind our camp up to the road, this was dense forest. It was that saying, you can't see the forest because of the trees. From the road, I'm looking in, I just see trees. That's all I see. So I walk back to our camp, and as I get to the meadow, David is kind of there looking in the grass that had been trampled, trying to see what he could see.
Yeah, I was just trying to see if there had to be some type of tracks or something going across there. It was just, there's multiple areas that like trampled down, but I couldn't get any like definite, prints or things. But this had to be right through these guys' camp. So I was kind of looking, and we found a couple of game trails behind their camp that crossed the road and went, across this meadow area that I was trying to look for prints and stuff. And then, so we decided to start following this trailways. We get going and following hey, I think this looks open here. Let's start going this way. And we started following this trailway. Then we end up coming on this, we find this real huge X, of these trees. And we're looking at that and go, look at this, and it's a perfect X. And these are large trees. And, we're trying to say, is this normal, or does this happen by stance, or what was it? But it was, two standing trees are, about, 6 feet apart and about a foot thick. And they're bent over, forming this perfect X, and it's right on this game trail that we were tracking, to go up there. And, the first tree had been pushed over, had a root ball on it, it started coming up with it. It was wedged between two other trees. But the second one was strange, was that in order for it to form the X, the tree had to be twisted. And you could tell, we took pictures of that, but the bottom of the tree wasn't being pulled up, but it was rotated and twisted. It was like you pull this tree down and push it over to fit between these two trees in order to form this X. There was like no way that was going to fall that way. And it wasn't falling. It was still in the ground. And it was just pushed over and twisted. And you could see the rotation in the bark at the bottom of the tree, where it's breaking off and rotating. And that's not natural, And what was crazy was that right after that, we followed the trail. We ended up right where Curtis had marked his trail.
Wow. An interesting point about the guy that you spoke to. I noticed you said that he relayed that they were running.
I think it's because of how quickly they moved. I mean, as David said, this area, he was probably maybe 30 yards from the creek, but from the sounds of what David had described and this guy had described, whatever they were had come from across the creek, and he was probably 30 yards from the creek, maybe a little more, and then another 100 to 150 yards up the trail. And by the time David gets out of his tent and wakes me up, nothing is heard. So I never heard any of this. So whatever happened, it covered a tremendous amount of ground, or they covered a tremendous amount of ground in 15, 20 seconds. It covered maybe 150 to 200 yards. So I don't know if he didn't see anything. He just, heard I guess, stomping, if you would. I don't know, football, I guess the better way of saying it. And because of the distance they covered, he couldn't get out of his tent quick enough either to see anything. I think he assumed they were running. I really don't know. I didn't question him on that.
No, it was moving fast. And, if I was looking at degrees, I'm pointing it towards the creek all the way to where it disappeared. It had to be within 20 or 30 seconds.
Was this all open meadow, or were there trees?
No, it's well, the meadow where their camp was, they were at the end of the meadow. So I had thought that it sounded like it was going right through their camp, but they said it was like right behind them. And we did find those two large game trails that went from the creek right behind their camp, across the entrance road that goes into the meadow. And that's where we started our trail and went up and found that X up there. So it was right close to them, but it was through the woods from the creek to where it got to the road that goes into the meadow.
A couple 100 yards at around 2:30 in the middle of the
morning.
Burn ban, so there's no light. There's no light. So whatever it was traveling at that speed in pitch black darkness.
Hooting, and then garbled talk, rah, 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 and then back to hooting, as they went up the ridge.
Yeah, so that was world-class speed, basically, and like I said, I hadn't heard all of that, but David's tent was 20 feet from mine, and literally what he told me was, he'd heard these hoots, but once he heard it moving, he unzipped his sleeping bag, unzipped his tent, and was at my tent, however long it takes to travel 20 feet, and he's trying to get me up, and when I wake up, I hear nothing. So, whatever time frame that is, like David said, it was measured in seconds, not in minutes by any means.
I mean, as someone who has heard the Sierra sounds, David, what did you think when you heard that?
I was like, that is talking. That was, to me, there was communication going on with whoever was moving that fast across there. And it was like, that was amazing. I go, what did I just hear? And I go, the only thing I could describe it was, that came to my mind was, the Sierra sounds. Sierra sounds were a little more separated in the conversation, if you know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
You'd hear one and then you hear another. This was like they were just at each other. Rah, 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 rah. It was like, right, and then it gets back into the hooting.
From your perspective, did it sound like two distinct voices?
It sounded more than that. It sounded to me like there was like at least three different things going. It was a pack of something. To me, it was all I could see was this. There's a group of something going across there, and they're moving fast. And
in David's, just to give him some more credence to what he said, without it prompting, the guy had said they to me, and he said there was more than one of them. So, and the interesting thing, he thought one of them might at one point been in a tree up above him. And as David said, they were camped right on the edge of where the forest met the meadow. They were maybe 10 feet into the meadow is all. So very easily something could have been above them. Or I suppose, the other explanation for something being right above their tent, not being in a tree, maybe if something was 10 feet tall.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're not used to hearing things 8 to 10 feet off the ground. So
Right. So whether something was actually in the tree or not, I don't know, but that's how he described it. And he definitely said they and them. And it was not one, whatever it was, behind his tent that night.
Did you guys stay any more nights after that?
Yeah, that was like on the second night that we were there that happened. Just kind of strange. After we went, the evening after we did that, we were woken up again by these hoots again coming across the creek. And I think, Curtis, you heard something walking, you know.
Yeah, so about 11:30, the hoots started across the creek. I had a recorder out that night. I've had some technical issues. I haven't been able to listen to the whole thing. I had it down close to where that guy's camp was. There was a sort of a Gypsy Meadows sign that I had taped my recorder to. I'm still trying to get through it to see if it picked up these hoots, but about 11:30, hoots across the creek, and then maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, I hear something moving behind our tents up this ridge, and I couldn't estimate how close it was, but it was close enough to hear, football. Now, I can't say, even though I'm an orthopedic surgeon, that I could say what was traveling there was bipedal, but something was definitely moving in the forest right behind us. And then, shortly after, maybe a few minutes after I heard this movement, kind of all hell broke loose with hoots all around us. And David could say more about that because they were real close to his tent.
Yeah, no, that was about that evening. There was something that just was like 10 yards from my tent. And it was, there's like a post where they used to tie horses in the meadow. And I felt it was like right by that post, and it woke me up, and it just, whoa, 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 and I was going, we had started talking, and are these things Bigfoots, or are they mimicking owls, or what are they? But what is this sound, that we keep hearing? And, that they go to whoop. So we did not know, but this thing was right outside my tent, and it was loud. And in the dark, I was like, do I turn on a light? Do I get out of my tent right now? This thing is standing, in the middle of the meadow, not in a tree. It was like in the middle of the meadow. And so I grabbed my phone and put the recorder on. I had planned to have it already ready to go in case something woke up. And by the time I turned it on, this loud whoop had moved across the meadow and was still going, and, I got some of those sounds, and it sounded like, we compare it to barred owls, but that's what it sounds like. But they eventually, the end of the, some of the ends of the hooting kind of trails off, and it becomes something different. And then that kept going on. Then I started hearing things further away, towards the north more, and then out behind our camp right there. And so, again, after a little bit, I got those sounds on my iPhone, that was good. But the original, the one that was 10 yards away, I'm like, do I get out? I had my 44, but I'm not, do I climb out of this? We're standing outside here, but that was pretty freaky to have something that close to you yelling that loud. It was just loud. It was tremendously loud.
Yeah. And I was awake, I don't know if anybody could have slept through it. It was, like David said, close. It was not, when they started, they had been maybe a quarter mile away where everything had started before. But now, I was probably 20 feet further from David, so maybe I was 50 feet from where it started. But something did answer it off to the north and off to the area where I'd heard football off to our east. So anyway, one time the day before, we had been, one of our hikes come up to where an owl was up in a tree, and it was probably 60 feet up in the tree. And when we got to within 100 feet of it, it took off. It didn't want to have anything to do with us. And when it took those first 4 or 5 wing flaps from 100 feet away, you could hear a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh as it, started to get up the energy to fly. And like David said, as this thing moved away from, right on the meadow just outside his tent to across the meadow, there was no wing flap that occurred. I mean, whatever had traveled crossed that 50 yards without that same noise of the owl. So again, we didn't pick up any pictures or anything like that on our game trails, but something got very close to our tents. And then, we go back to bed. I didn't hear anything more the rest of the night. David's been listening to his recordings, and like he said, he's been comparing them to barred owls, and they're similar, but they're definitely different on his spectrum analysis. So, again, were these owls? I don't think so, because it didn't fly away. Owls don't typically run away. And the spectrum analysis is slightly different. But the next morning, we both walked down towards the bathroom again, and this little road that led into the meadow had been scraped, out of the forest, and it was essentially hardpack, and we could stomp on it even on wet ground, and we wouldn't leave a footprint. But David's 1-ton truck had left a track and where the tire was, and it had chewed up a little bit of the dirt, and there was about an 18-inch by 6-inch wet footprint right in his tire track. And we hadn't seen it there before, and it was wet.
Wow.
It was not a big indentation, nothing you could cast. It was just a wet footprint, which made us think it was, relatively recent. And then we started searching around that area, and that footprint basically was right next to another tree break that was about 9.5 feet off the ground. So, if you believe in tree breaks as being markers, then this is potentially an area where whatever it was used to crossing that little road that went into the meadow. If not, it was coincidental, but now we've found 2 tree breaks within about 150 yards, both of which seem to mark a trail, or at least a place where something had come out of the woods and crossed the road.
The tree was alive. No, that tree break, the tree was alive.
Wow.
And so that the tree, the upper leaves on the break were turning yellow. They weren't been dead for very long, but the branches below the break, were still green.
And you guys didn't notice the tree break prior to that?
No, we hadn't seen that.
We hadn't seen it. Doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Right, sure.
It was right by that. It was right by that foot, that track that we found.
And was the track, where was the track in relation to the creek?
It was in the same area where we had heard that pack go through.
So maybe 100 feet from the creek.
Yeah, probably
give or take.
in the direction of the road, and then off to the main road, towards the main road. It was the same area where we had heard that pack go through there. And the interesting was why is there only one track? There had to be a huge stride in order to get from across the road to that one area. It just looked like a wet track. I think I sent a picture of it and put my foot by it to see how big it was. But it had to be a huge stride to get across just by one step.
Were the vocalizations each night starting around the same time and coming from the same general area?
So the first night they started around midnight, and yet they were coming from the same area that we had heard that original hooting when I started up my air pump. Maybe across the creek, maybe, sounds are sometimes hard to estimate distance, but I would say about a quarter mile away. Then that first midnight and 1 o'clock, when I heard them before I fell asleep, they seemed to come from the same area, but again, were answered by something else to the north and the east. And then that night when the hoot started about 11:30, that first hoot was in that same direction. And one of the days, while we had nothing else to do, we went off over that side of the creek, and we could not find a trail. And we were basically bushwhacking it. And, I had my Garmin on just so we could make sure we get back to camp. And we were going slow and looking for things, but we went a total of 3/4 of a mile out, 3/4 of a mile back, and it took us over 2 hours to travel across the creek, bushwhacking it over deadfall and all these other things. And so that's the only thing we could find up there. And then, on a map, there are no trails up on that side of the creek whatsoever. It's just, as best we could tell, wilderness.
Wow. My brain is just raised. I wonder if that's just like maybe a travel route that they're taking that just happens to go through that meadow?
It has to be something, because that's and I don't know if that X has anything to do with it.
As I said, Will Fulmer has a video specifically on campsite 17 where he's had a lot of activity, and that is probably a mile from Gypsy Meadows, maybe. So he's had a lot of activity right in the exact same area. So, maybe it is a roadway for them, so to speak. Have
you reached out to Will about this?
So I did send him a message on one of his videos, and I emailed him, and that was probably 3 weeks ago. On his video, he kind of gave my comment a like, and in my email, I sent him basically what I had sent you, our 2 Facebook posts that kind of listed everything, and he has not responded back to me. So I have not been in touch with him. But basically, he's kind of the reason we went to this area, just seeing his videos online, and we've had, some similar experiences. But as you may or may not remember, we weren't quite done yet.
Yeah.
As amazing as it sounds, we weren't done. So that day, that evening, we'd heard the hoots the night before, seen the wet footprint. Right around dinner time, we heard that hooting, but this time it started behind us up the ridge, not across the ridge. And I'll kind of let David take over as to what happened after that.
Yeah, we were just relaxing in our hammocks, and all of a sudden, as the days have gone along, we start wondering, are these hoots Bigfoot, because of everything that's been going on. All of a sudden we hear this thing, and we heard this loud hoot going on, just like I would estimate only 30 yards up on the ridge behind our camp. You think is that close, Curtis?
Yeah, it was closer than, it had been from across the creek by far.
Yeah. So as soon as we heard that, we were in our hammocks. We jumped out of my hammock and let's go. And we grabbed our guns, grabbed our gear, and we started heading up that ridge. And the call was coming a little bit from where we're looking out towards our camp, towards the main road. It was a little left of where the X was. But we started going up this ridge, and, I grabbed my camera, my video camera, had it on. I was thinking, we are close to something. We're going to see something right here. And we started hiking up. We'd gone up. We'd seen some, steep inset footprints, probably 16 inches, but they're about 4 inches deep on this ridge that we were going up there. And as we're going along, all of a sudden, we hear these 3 whoops. It's like definite whoop, 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 in a different direction. And I turned to Curtis and I said, I'm not getting distracted. I'm not getting pulled away in a different direction. We're going this direction. And because this is where we heard what we were, but we felt like we were being pulled in a different direction, like something was trying to distract us and pull us in a different thing. And we kept going. We didn't see anything that time. We were going really slow, trying to, look in the area and film it. And then my video camera battery started going out, and it started getting dark, and we decided to head back. We heard the 3 whoops were coming more from where we had seen the X, in that direction. But I thought the whoops were on the other side of the road, from where they were.
And before we turn back, David, you probably remember, you just forgot to say it, the direction we were heading, we found another tree structure that I can only describe as a teepee, probably 4 or 5 20-foot long sticks, branches, whatever you want to call them, all coming together at their tips, just like a teepee would that you'd see in the movies. And that was the direction that we'd heard the first call. And when we saw that, and like David said, we now hear the whoops, we decided to keep going towards the teepee because we had seen that, and we sort of made a pact on our drive up. We'd seen people describe that they heard something, they'd go one way, and then they might hear a tree break in another direction, like they were being distracted. So we had made a sort of a pact that if we hear something like that, and of course we never expected to hear a distracting call, we would keep going. But like David said, we didn't really find anything and went back to our camp now. It was pretty much dark, and that night was pretty quiet. The next morning, we got up about 7:30 or so. We slept in, and we both decided to walk down to the bathroom. And like we said, this whole week there had been a guy in a trailer parked maybe 100 feet past the bathroom, sort of in the last camping spots before you turn into the meadow. And we had waved at him a few times, said hi to him as we drove by, or he was walking his dog. We said hi, but we'd never really talked to him. So David goes off to the bathroom, and I decided to walk out past his trailer up to the main road. And, I'd always explored up the road. I decided while David's in the bathroom, I'm going sort of down the road. And I went down about 100 yards, didn't find any tree breaks or any trails. So I kind of cut back into the campground there, and the rest of the campsites were completely empty. And when I had walked past his trailer, initially he was inside, and now I came back to his spot, and he was outside clearly looking around. And, this time, instead of saying hi, like we'd said 4 or 5 times before, his first words out of his mouth were, "Hey, is your buddy dressed all in tan from head to toe?" And I said, "No. First of all, I think he's in blue." I was trying to remember what David was wearing. And I said, "Second of all,
black pants and my, orange jacket."
I said, "Second of all, he's still in the bathroom." And he said, "Well, I kind of saw you walk up to the road out of one of my windows, and I sat down, and about 10 seconds after I sat down, my dog is just at the door scratching and barking. So I get up thinking that one of you guys had kind of come into my campsite, which, like you said before, who's going to throw pine cones? Who's going to walk into some guy's campsite uninvited at 7 a.m? But so he said, I figured one of you guys were in my campsite. And I said, "No, I'm just coming back from my walk down the road." He said, "Well, when my dog was barking, I got up and looked out the window, and something big and tan, I just barely saw it for a second, walked from the creek area to across the road." And again, as I said before, where a road hadn't been scraped or a campsite made, the forest was very thick, and you could just, when you look into something, all you see is trees. And he was only 100 feet from the bathroom. And when you stood at the bathroom, you couldn't see his trailer. So what he had seen for a brief second was tall and big. And David's 6'4" and 250 pounds. That's why he thought it was David. And it had walked from the creek area to across the road. So David gets out of the bathroom, and we start looking around, and of course, we find nothing. And then we start talking to the guy and asking him what he had heard the last few days. And he was a second confirmation of David hearing all that ruckus at the edge of the meadow, even though he was a little further away than the other campers were. He heard the same stuff happening in the middle of the night, some motion in the woods, calls and stuff like that. And then he said, I've heard some weird things while I've been here. I've heard knocks. I heard a tree get knocked over off in that wilderness area across the creek. And he said, "I think I just saw Bigfoot." That's literally what he said. And I don't know how to dispute what he saw. We didn't see it, but there was no one else in any of the other campgrounds. And again, this is 7 o'clock in the morning. Coming from the wilderness across the creek and walking up to the road to that other area up the ridge where we had seen a broken tree before. So, we didn't see anything again, But this guy, and we were not trying to talk him into Bigfoot, he kind of came to that conclusion himself that he thinks for a second or two he might have seen a Bigfoot, because it was tan, he said, from head to toe.
I mean, what else could it have been? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
He knew what he saw. That's why he was hoping that you'd be like, oh, yeah, my friend's out here wearing a hooded sweatsuit.
Yeah, a tan jumpsuit from head to toe.
Yeah.
So that we were kind of getting ready to leave the next day, and that late afternoon, David kind of had a thought, remembering back to what we had found in California. And I'll kind of let him say what he was thinking and what we eventually found up there.
Yeah, well, that day before, when we had chased that hoot up the thing on coming back, I had noticed a wet area, a marsh area off to the right towards the direction where we'd seen the X. And I had just noted it in my head. And on last day, I told Curtis that, hey, I want to go up and explore that marsh area again. This is another, track trap and see what we can find. And so I didn't want to leave without doing that. And so we go walking up there, and we come into the marsh, and lo and behold, I come around a corner, and I see these two footprints right in the mud. And I go, look at that. And we go over there, and actually this time we had measuring tapes and things like that. I got a stick and marked them and measured them when we got back to our truck. But we found two footprints. Again, I measured them 16 and a half inches long. And the stride was 48 inches. A stride with this, the step length was 48 inches to 52 inches. And we started looking back behind it in line, and we noticed in the wet area of that marsh, we could see definite footstep disturbances, because there's like, the needles of the tree all fall in the water, and they're all, the whole place, all the water is covered with these needles except for where these footprints landed. And it's all disturbed and cleared out. And you could see that, and they're all about the same stride length and going out. And I said, look at that. There's one there. And we go back the same distance. There's another one. So you start, when you start looking for the next track, you want to look at the same distance and see where that's where you're going to start looking for evidence and stuff. And we backed up with about 5 different steps so we could identify disturbances in that wet, water area. Then it comes into the mud where left that, first footprint we saw that we could see toes on, and then the second one was 48 to 52. And then we start walking further back in that same line, and we found another one in another smaller wet area going up a little incline that looked like we measured it again. It was 16 and a half inches long. And that one we could definitely see toes in the ferns and things like that. So that was an exciting way to end our search at that day. And we took pictures of all that and stuff. So that was kind of exciting.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, that one that was about 100 feet behind was in the exact line of progression of those other 4. And although they were wet and we couldn't cast them, there was definitely a print that you could see toes. And, it was 16 and a half inches long. As David said, we both wear size 13. I've measured my foot. It's 11 and a half inches, just about, or just above 11 and a half inches. Even with my shoe, it's only 13 and a half inches. And so, we've been pretty lucky on our trips, but we've gone into all these trips, like I said, at least trying to rule out the possibility that these could all be human events. And that's sort of what science is all based on. They call it the null hypothesis. You try to rule out that it could have happened randomly. Well, in this case, it's not a science experiment, but we tried to rule out whether they could or could not have been human. So when we got back into civilization, I kind of looked up, what is a 16 and a half footprint or 16 and a half inch footprint? And that's basically Shaquille O'Neal's foot. His foot is 16 and a half inches, and he wears a size 22 shoe.
Yeah.
And I then start looking, now I'm going down a rabbit hole as trying to figure out how common this would be.
Sure.
A barefoot guy, 7 foot tall, walking in the middle of the forest. Well, I find out that, to be 7 foot tall or above, it's only one person in 260,000 people. It's very, very rare. And then I said, well, how many people have world-class speed, to travel 150 yards in 15 seconds? And that's not even on the flat. That's in the dark across, basically bushwhacking it across land. But even on a flat track, I Googled, how many people have world-class speed, and Google couldn't answer it, but it said it is by far much less than 1%. So, if you take the 1 in 260,000 and say it's maybe a 0.5% chance that a person could run in world-class speed, now you're talking 1 in 5 million chance that, a 7 foot tall person could run at world-class speed. And then you start thinking, like I said, in the dark, no flashlight, in 40-degree weather, in a light rain, barefoot across terrain. That's just impossible for a human. When we, as scientists in medicine, when we look at two forms of treatment and try to figure out which one is better for a certain disease or a certain entity, they study patients and they put them in one group, and they study maybe a different medicine in a different group. If there is less than a 5% chance that could have happened randomly in science, that is considered statistically significant. In other words, there's a 95% chance that did not occur randomly. You change your medical treatment just based on a 5% chance. And here we have odds that even there was a person in the middle of the forest at much, much less than 1 in 5 million. So then I start going down the rabbit hole, knowing that in orthopedics we have gait analysis studies. And I start looking at stride length or step length, and even at Shaquille O'Neal's height, his average walking, from one heel of the right foot to the left heel, or the heel of his left foot in one normal step, is just under 36 inches. So I then kind of extrapolate from that. Well, what does a 48-inch stride or step length mean? And if you use that same equation and go backwards, that means if it was a human, they were 9 feet 6 inches tall.
Wow.
If it was a human. So then I start looking up, are there even, who's the tallest human in the world? And the tallest person known in recorded time was 8 feet 11 inches, and he died in 1940. And the current tallest person alive lives in Turkey, and he's 8 foot 3 inches. So, to have something with a stride length that equals 9 feet 6 inches in height, doing all that stuff that we just described, as scientists, even though we haven't seen Bigfoot and we haven't taken a picture of Bigfoot, I think David and I are now, even though I was skeptical before our California trip, I think we're in the camp that Bigfoot was there, both in California and Washington. It's just that, they're still the hide and seek champions of the world and haven't completely been found. We have no other conclusion. I mean, the science, just points to that. There's no other thing that could have done all the things that we experienced, even though we did not see a Bigfoot.
I think it would also be fairly safe to say, I mean, even with your statistics, whenever a human reaches a certain height threshold, their athletic ability actually starts to decline. I mean, I can't imagine, the guy that you were talking about who was the world's tallest man that passed away in the 40s or whatever, he definitely was not running, let alone at world-class speed. He was barely able to walk, so.
Right. Right. There's no doubt. And that's often why, those tall guys often have very short NBA careers. Bill Walton started having bad foot problems. He was 6'11", and he was a great center for like his first 3 years playing in the NBA. And then he was a decent, off the bench player for 8 or 9 years, but his feet gave out. He was not the same athlete after, 2 or 3 years of pounding in the NBA at the end of his career than he was at the beginning. So you're right. I don't see, if it was a human, that they could run 150 yards in world-class speed.
That's just crazy. You guys really hit the jackpot. Do you have any plans of going back to that location?
Yeah, I think we got asked to come up and do a video recording and tell our story in the spring. So I think we're planning on going up there in the spring and,
that was Jonathan. Jonathan
asked us to come up and do that.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I look forward to that. Any plans to go on any more outings at different locations? Yeah,
we are. I think we're hooked.
Nothing in the book. Nothing in the books, but we're, I can't imagine they will be as good or exciting of an experience as our first 2 trips. But even if they're not, like I said, we kind of went into this just wanting to go camping with our best friend. And I think in a way we were, lucky and blessed to have found what we found.
Well, guys, I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your experiences and your stories. And if you have any more, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear about it.
Hey, thanks for listening, Matt.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you've had an encounter with Bigfoot or something else unexplained and you'd like to share your story on Bigfoot Crossroads, email me at bigfootcrossroads@gmail.com. Check out the website, bigfootcrossroads.com. You can find links to social media, past episodes, merchandise, everything you need all in one place. And until next time, remember, there's something in the woods.